morning, Ms. Potter.
Good morning.
You've been a police officer, or were a police officer for 26 years. Is that right? You said you started in 1995?
Yes.
And that was with the Brooklyn Center Police Department for that entire career, right?
Yes.
And you said that you resigned from the Brooklyn Center Police Department, right?
Yes.
And that was on April 12th of this year, right?
Yeah, within a day or two of the incident.
Right after you had shot and killed Daunte Wright.
Yes.
And throughout that time period, you were a licensed peace officer, right?
Yes.
And to become licensed, you had to go through a number of requirements. Fair?
Yes.
You had a college degree.
Excuse me, Your Honor, the prosecutor speaking and that mic too.
Sure.
Thank you.
You have a college degree, right?
Yes.
And you also had to complete the peace officer education program, that skills component that you talked about.
Yes.
And that included the skill sets and classroom training as well.
Yes.
You had to pass an exam to become an officer.
Yes.
And then you did all that before you started with the Brooklyn Center Police Department in 95, right?
Yes.
And then you got your license through the post board, correct?
Yes.
And that stands for Peace Officer Standards and Training.
Yes.
So you were licensed throughout that whole 26-year career, right?
Yes.
And you maintained all of the requirements to keep your license?
Yes.
Including all the training that was required for it as well, right?
Yes.
And that training that's required for your license has all different kinds of components, true?
Yes.
You have things like use of force, use of firearms, tasers, all kinds of things.
Yes.
And you did all that training.
Yes.
And you did all that every year throughout that 26-year period, right?
Yes.
Sometimes multiple times a year, right?
Yes.
And all of those requirements were in place to make sure that you were at the beginning of your career and continued to be, competent and capable of performing the requirements of the job, right?
Yes.
You mentioned on direct that you were also a hostage negotiator as part of your duties, right?
Crisis negotiator.
Crisis negotiator. Did that involve some hostage type situations?
I've never had a hostage situation.
Okay, but crisis negotiation.
Yes.
And that involved some de-escalation tactics, I presume, correct?
Yes.
And you had to develop that skill set and be pretty good at de-escalating situations as a crisis negotiator, fair?
Yes.
So you had some experience in stressful situations doing that?
No.
So you were a crisis negotiator but never experienced a stressful situation?
We talk to people.
Talk to people in crisis.
Yes.
And part of your job as a police officer is dealing with people on their worst days, right?
Yes.
People who don't want to cooperate with you sometimes, right?
Most of the people we talk to in crisis are either barricaded behind a door or talking to you from another room.
Okay. For 26 years, you were a patrol officer, right?
Yes.
So you saw people out on the street every day as part of your job duties. Okay?
Yes.
And you talked about doing a lot of traffic stops during that career, correct?
I did some traffic stops.
Okay. Well, in some of those cases, there are people who have weapons, right?
Yes.
Sometimes people want to flee, right?
Yes.
Sometimes people are violent.
Yes.
And all of that's part of being a police officer, dealing with people in those situations, right?
Yes.
You'd agree that you're bound by policy and the requirements of the job that Brooklyn Center, the police department, sets for you, right?
Yes.
And you heard Commander Fleslin testify, but you have to acknowledge those policies and essentially agree to abide by them every year you were an officer, fair?
Yes.
And you'd agree that your fundamental duty as a police officer is to safeguard life, right?
Yes.
And you also have the duty to never employ unnecessary force. True?
Yes.
Part of the policy also includes some of your responsibilities as an officer, right?
Yes.
And that includes being alert and attentive and capable of performing your job, right?
Yes.
And getting back to the training and sort of the post requirements, there's a lot of training that goes into being a police officer, fair?
Yes.
And we talked about a couple of those things, but one of those subjects is use of force, right?
Is that a yes? Yes.
And use of force can include things like restraints, handcuffs, defensive tactics, chemical irritants, using batons, tasers, less lethal weapons, and firearms as well, right? All those things are options available to you. True?
Not all of them.
Okay, well, you carry a whole number of things on your duty belt every day, right?
Yes.
And that includes a firearm and a taser, right?
Yes.
And you also had other items on that duty belt as well, correct?
Yes.
And as part of the training that you went through every year, they cover topics of all kinds of uses of force, right?
Yes.
Including the things on your duty belt and maybe other options that the department could use additionally, true?
Only the things I was assigned on my duty belt.
Okay. But in any case, that use of force training was a pretty key component of being an officer, right?
Yes.
You were trained about when you could use force, how much force to use, and what would be appropriate force. Fair?
Fair.
And not only were you trained on that, but you had a lot of policy that that dictated what you could and could not do in a particular situation, right?
Yes.
And you were also trained on the readiness aspects of use of force, right? Being ready to engage whatever force might be required, right?
Yes.
Including making decisions under stress, right?
What do you mean?
Well, you had a lot of scenario-based training, right?
Yes.
And in those situations, those scenarios were set up to be as close as they could be to real life, right?
I suppose.
So you would be trained to have to make decisions in the moment about what to do and what force to use, right?
Well, it was a training situation, so it was usually slow and meticulous and controlled.
Well, you did this year after year, right, for the entirety of your career, correct?
I think scenario-based training started later, probably the last 10 or 15 years.
Sure, but use of force training has been around for a long time, right?
Yes.
Because since you started as a police officer, you have, in some cases, had to use force, true?
Yes.
And there are limitations on how and when to use that force, right?
Yes.
So you've had training on that throughout your entire career, right?
Yes.
And as part of that process, the way that it's required for you to maintain your license is that you sign in and you sign off on attendance forms, and you basically, you have to be there, right? You can't not be there, right?
Right.
And every year you have a certain number of training hours that are required, right?
Yes.
And you said on direct that you participated and you were paying attention during all those trainings, true?
Yes.
And some of those trainings had classroom instruction, PowerPoints, things like that, right?
Yes.
Some of them also included reviewing policies and other documents, right?
Yes.
And then there was also the hands-on training with the practical components, things like using, drawing weapons, things like that, right?
Yes.
And over the course of your career, you completed many, many, many hours of training, right?
Yes.
And in terms of credit hours, we're talking somewhere in the ballpark of 1,700 credit hours. Does that sound right?
I don't know the number of hours, but if that's what you have, that would be probably right.
No reason to dispute that your training hours would have been in the thousands of hours over that 26-year career, right?
Yes.
You indicated that there weren't tasers available when you first started at Brooklyn Center. True?
No, they came in the early 2000s.
Okay. But in 1996, you had a firearm, right?
In 1995, yes.
Sorry, 95, and then you were sworn in 96, right?
No, I was sworn in February 27th, 1995.
Okay. So in 95, when you first started, you had a firearm available to you.
Yes.
And you were trained to use that firearm.
Yes.
Trained how to handle it, right?
Yes.
Trained how to load it and unload it.
Yes.
Trained how to draw it,
Yes.
right? And fire it. And how to safely handle it, yes?
Yes.
And that included when not to fire it, right?
I suppose.
And that training started at the beginning of your career, you said in 95, but continued every year up until the time you resigned, right?
Yes.
Now, you indicated that tasers came later, but you were first trained on using a taser in 2002, correct?
If that's what the documents say, I'm not sure when they came out.
And if the documents say you were trained in 2002, you then would have been trained every year thereafter, right?
Yes.
And you started carrying a taser on your duty belt regularly as of 2005, right?
Yes.
But at a minimum, in addition to all the other training you had, you would have had taser training year after year for at least the last 19 years, right?
Yes.
And the taser training that's required, you saw the documents that were in court, also requires not only it requires review of policy, right? The taser policy, right?
Yes.
And it also requires practicing those reaction side draws, correct?
Sometimes.
All right, if we could put up Exhibit 334, please, the last page. I'm going to put on the screen what's already been admitted as Exhibit 334. And we're going to scroll down to the very last page and highlight the subsection C, please. So, as part of the taser policy includes that all training should include performing reaction hand draws or cross draws to reduce the possibility of accidentally drawing and firing a firearm. That's part of the policy, right?
That's what it says.
And that's part of what you're trained to do, correct?
We didn't always we aren't always drawing our tasers from our holsters. A lot of times we were in plain clothes during training.
Okay. Well, your policy that you're required to abide by, that you signed off on, requires that you perform reaction hand draws, true?
During the training, yes.
It also includes the reason for that, right?
Yes.
And that's so that you reduce the possibility of accidentally drawing and firing a firearm, right?
Yes.
And we can take that down. Part of the reason for that is weapons confusion, right?
Yes.
And that was known in the field and has been known for a number of years. True?
I guess.
Well, you were trained on it, right?
We talked about it.
It was part of your PowerPoints, correct?
Yes.
You were made aware during PowerPoint after PowerPoint after PowerPoint that drawing and firing the wrong weapon can happen, right?
We were told it wasn't something that they expounded on.
You were told that.
Yes.
And you signed documentation every year you were certified acknowledging that you knew the risks, received and reviewed the materials required for you to carry that taser, correct?
Yes, I signed the document.
Okay. Now, in terms of the carrying of these weapons, reaction side means what for you?
That would be my left hand.
Okay. You're right-handed?
Yes.
So carrying a taser, you have done for years on your left side, correct?
Yes.
And your firearm you carry where?
On my right side.
How many years have you carried your firearm and your taser that way?
my firearm for 26 years, and my taser, according to your documents, for 19.
So as long as you've had that taser, you've carried it on your left side, correct?
In the beginning, I carried it on my right side in a drop holster.
And when did you switch?
When we were given new holsters?
And when would that have been?
I don't know.
Okay. But far before 2016, you saw the images that were up in court. Long before that, you were carrying your taser on your left side, correct?
Yes.
Years and years, right?
Yes.
We talked a little bit about reality or scenario-based training. When you go through those trainings, you have available to you all the options that would be on your duty belt, right? Although inert for the purposes of training, right?
Yes.
And the purpose of that training is to try to recreate real-life stressful situations as best as possible to practice making those types of decisions in the moment. Fair?
Fair.
Let's talk a little bit about your taser. You'd agree that the Taser 7 that you have and the taser you had before that has a safety mechanism on the side of it, right?
Yes.
And you have to flip it up to arm the taser?
Yes.
And when the taser is on and armed, it beeps, right?
I don't know if it beeps.
There's a display screen that turns on.
Yes.
And then there are two lasers with the Taser 7 that appear on your target, right?
Yes.
A green one for the top probe, right?
I believe so. It was a new taser.
And a red one for the bottom?
I would guess so, yes.
Well, you were trained on it, right?
Yes, but it was a while back.
Well, you were trained in March of this year on that taser, correct?
Yes.
And you have to successfully operate and handle that taser in order to be certified to use it, correct?
Yes.
And you went through that hands-on process of turning on that taser and safely handling that taser in order to be certified, correct?
Yes, in March.
In March. And before that, you had an X26P, correct?
Yes.
And that taser also had a laser and a safety and things like that, right?
Yes.
The screen that turned on.
Yes.
And the taser, and that was the taser that you had been carrying for years before, right?
Yes.
Very similar to the Taser 7 in that way.
Similar but different.
All right, so I'm going to put on the screen next to each other, please, Exhibits 210 and Exhibit 212. Now, this is a picture, side-by-side pictures of you on April 11th, correct?
Yes.
And your taser is pictured on the left side of your duty belt, correct?
Yes.
And that's the way you'd been carrying it for years and years, correct?
Yes.
And your firearm you carried on the right side of your duty belt, right?
Yes.
And you'd agree that the standard procedure for a reaction side, left-hand draw for your taser in this case, would be to draw that weapon with your left hand, correct?
Yes.
All right, you can take that down. You were asked some questions on direct about spark testing, the function test of the taser. The policy says that you should do that before the beginning of every shift, right?
Yes.
And you didn't do it the last 2 shifts that you worked, correct?
That's what the documents say.
Right. You didn't do one for the last 4 of your last 10 shifts that you worked, in fact, correct? If that's what the documents say.
Which dates?
You didn't do it on March 27th, correct?
I guess.
You didn't do it on March 28th.
Your Honor, I object to this cross-examination if she doesn't know.
All right. Okay, one-word objections, please. If she doesn't know, she can say she doesn't know.
The documents show that you didn't do a spark test 4 of your last 10 shifts. You have no reason to dispute that, right?
No.
And the day of this incident, on April 11th, you didn't do a spark test that day, right?
No, according to the documents.
And even though, that day was a slow and uneventful day at the beginning of the day, right?
I don't know. I don't have a log.
Well, you told Dr. Miller that that day started as a slow and uneventful Sunday, right?
I don't know if I did or not.
Council sidebar.